The emergency radio crackled at 4:47 in the morning, and the voice on the other end wasn't calm. 87 casualties, ETA 9 minutes, multiple blast injuries, tension pneumos, arterial bleeds. These men are dying. Inside the trauma bay of Harlow General Hospital, every senior physician stood frozen. The charge nurse dropped her clipboard. The ER director was already reaching for his phone, not to mobilize his team, but to call administration. Nobody moved toward the supply carts. Nobody started pulling trauma kits. Nobody except a quiet blonde woman in the back of the room who had been told, less than 40 minutes ago, that she wasn't needed here. Before you find out what happened next, if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and don't miss a single story. These are the kinds of stories that don't make the headlines, but absolutely should. And while you're at it, drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The shift had started badly and gotten worse. Harlow General Hospital sat at the edge of Creston Valley, Montana, a mid-sized regional medical center that served a sprawl of rural communities, a National Guard installation 12 miles north, and a stretch of mountain highway that sent trauma cases in every few days, whether anyone was ready or not. The hospital wasn't small exactly, but it wasn't equipped the way its administration liked to pretend. The equipment was aging, the staffing was thin, and the gap between what the hospital claimed it could handle and what it actually could was a gap that the people working the floor understood in their bones, even if nobody said it out loud. Mara Dowell had been a trauma nurse at Harlow General for 3 years. Before that, she had spent 6 years as a special operations combat medic attached to units she still wasn't cleared to name in public. She was 35 years old, 5'6", with light hair that she kept pulled back so tight it almost looked painted on, and the kind of stillness in her face that people sometimes mistook for blankness. It wasn't blankness. It was the practiced calm of someone who had learned, the hard way, that panic was contagious and composure was a clinical tool. She had come to Harlow General because it was close to where her mother lived, and because after 6 years of working in places that broke people apart, she had wanted somewhere quieter. She hadn't found quiet exactly, but she had found something like routine, and for a while that had been enough. The problem with Harlow General wasn't the patients. The problem was Director Garrison Holt. Holt was 52, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had once been athletic, and now carried the echo of it in his frame, with a jaw that led the rest of his face and a management philosophy that could be summarized as hierarchy first, outcomes second. He had been brought in from a larger hospital system in the Pacific Northwest to modernize Harlow General's operations, and what that had meant in practice was a cascade of restructuring memos, budget freezes, and a new policy requiring all nursing staff to route clinical concerns through department supervisors before raising them directly with physicians. Mara had violated that policy twice. Not carelessly. She had raised concerns that turned out to be right both times, had done it because patients were at risk, and had documented everything. The second time, a physician named Dr. Stuart Farwell, who served as trauma chief and who did not enjoy being corrected by nursing staff, had filed a formal complaint with Holt's office. That complaint had been sitting on Holt's desk for 3 weeks. At 4:09 in the morning, it stopped sitting there. Mara had been assigned to the overnight trauma rotation, which was how she came to be standing in the supply corridor outside Trauma Bay 1 when Holt arrived in the ER, not in response to any clinical emergency, but apparently because he made rounds at unusual hours and because he had decided, this particular morning, to handle the complaint in person. She heard him before she saw him. His footsteps were deliberate, the kind that announced themselves. Nurse Dowell. She turned. Holt was standing at the corridor entrance with Farwell 2 steps behind him, which told her everything she needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. "Director Holt," she said, "I've reviewed the complaint filed by Dr. Farwell." Holt clasped his hands in front of him. "And I've reviewed your file. This is the second time in 8 months you've gone around the established communication chain. That's a pattern. I raised patient safety concerns through the fastest available channel. Both times the concern was, both times you inserted yourself into a physician's clinical decision without authorization," Farwell said, cutting her off. He was a tall man with a clipped beard and the careful enunciation of someone who chose words as weapons. "That's not nursing. That's interference." Mara kept her face still. Mr. Holt, I'd like to walk through the specifics of each incident. I've read the documentation. Holt's tone was final. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to general observation. No trauma rotation, no ER floor assignment, no direct patient contact in acute or critical settings without supervisor sign-off. He paused. This isn't punitive. This is a structural decision. She looked at him for a moment. People could die in this ER because you're pulling experienced trauma staff from... People will be fine, Farwell said. Leave real medicine to the physicians, Dowell. That's not an insult. That's a job description. Mara didn't answer that. She looked at the supply cart beside her, at the intubation kit she'd been checking before they arrived, and she set it down carefully on the shelf. Understood, she said, because there was nothing else useful to say. She walked out of the supply corridor and neither man said another word. She made it as far as the staff lounge before she stopped and stood still for a moment, alone. The lounge smelled like burnt coffee and vending machine plastic, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with a frequency that had been bothering her for weeks. She pressed her palms flat on the break room table and breathed. She was angry. She let herself feel it because suppressing it didn't help. It just moved it somewhere else and let it leak out sideways. 6 years of operating in environments where mistakes cost lives had given her a particular sensitivity to institutional dysfunction, and what she had just experienced was textbook institutional dysfunction, authority protecting itself at the expense of function. She had seen it in the field. She had seen it cost lives in the field. The difference here was that in the field, there had usually been someone above the dysfunction who could intervene. Here, the dysfunction was sitting at the top of the org chart. She poured coffee she didn't particularly want, sat down, and pulled out the small notebook she carried everywhere. She wrote the date and time. She wrote what had been said, by whom, and in what sequence. If this ever went anywhere, a review board, a licensing complaint, anywhere, she wanted the record clean. She was 3 sentences into that account when the radio on the desk crackled to life. The voice belonged to whoever was staffing the emergency dispatch channel, and the voice was not calm. Harlow General, this is National Guard Medical Coordination. We have a mass casualty event in progress. 87 personnel with combat-grade injuries incoming, ETA approximately 9 minutes. Blast trauma, penetrating injuries, tension pneumothorax presentations, multiple arterial bleeds. We need full trauma activation now. Mara was on her feet before the transmission finished. The lounge was adjacent to the ER corridor, and she could hear, through the wall, the sounds of a unit that was not mobilizing correctly. Raised voices. A phone ringing unanswered. The particular quality of noise that happened when too many people were talking and nobody was moving. She pushed through the door. The ER looked exactly like she'd feared. 4 nurses were clustered near the desk. 2 residents were standing in the middle of the floor, one of them on a phone, the other staring at the entrance doors as if waiting for instructions. Dr. Farwell was near Trauma Bay 1, speaking rapidly to someone on his own phone. Administration, she guessed, not logistics. Holt was still present, standing near the nursing station with his arms crossed, scanning the room with the expression of a man trying to project control he didn't actually have. Nobody had started pulling crash carts. Nobody had opened the mass casualty supply lockers. Nobody had contacted the OR to clear tables. Who's coordinating triage? Mara said. The question landed into a brief silence. Several people looked at her. Farwell turned from his phone call. Dowell. His voice was flat. You're on observation rotation. You need to step back. Who is coordinating triage? She said again, to the room. Nobody answered. She moved to the nearest supply cabinet, pulled it open, and started pulling trauma kits. Her hands knew where everything was. 3 years on this floor, same cabinet, same inventory order. She carried 4 kits to the central table, set them down, and looked at the nearest nurse, a younger woman named Priya Khatri, who had good instincts and who Mara had quietly mentored for most of the past year. Priya, get 2 nurses and start rolling crash carts to every bay. I need every bay open and stocked before the first vehicle clears the entrance. Priya looked at Farwell. Farwell looked at Mara. Something happened in the air of the ER, a kind of held breath. Do it, Mara said, and her voice had something in it that she didn't use often. A quality from a different life, a voice that had been calibrated to cut through gunfire and helicopter noise, and the screaming of men in the worst moments of their lives. Not loud, never loud, just precise and absolute. Priya moved. The other nurses moved with her. Farwell took a step toward Mara. "You have been formally reassigned. If you continue to, then report me later," she said, without looking at him. She was already at the radio, pulling up the incoming frequency. "Right now we have 9 minutes, and you have 87 people who need somewhere to land." She keyed the radio. "National Guard Med Cord, this is Harlow General Trauma Floor. Confirm incoming casualty breakdown. How many expectant? How many immediate? How many delayed? We need to know what we're sorting before you arrive." A pause. Then a new voice came back, male, clipped, with the cadence of someone who had made a lot of these calls. "Harlow General, we have approximately 30 immediate, 40 delayed, 17 expectant, but salvageable, with rapid surgical intervention. 3 of the immediate presentations are tension pneumo. We need chest decompression capability ready at the door." "Copy," Mara said. "We'll have needle decompression kits at every bay. What's your largest vehicle?" 4-vehicle convoy. Lead vehicle has the most critical. Expect 2 patients requiring direct OR transfer. Do not stop in trauma bay." "Understood. We'll have a path cleared to the OR elevator." She released the radio and turned back to the room. "Priya, I need the OR corridor cleared and lit. Call up and tell them we have 2 direct-to-surgical incoming. They need to be ready to receive before the first convoy vehicle stops." Priya was already on the phone. Farwell was watching her from across the room. His expression had moved through anger and arrived somewhere that looked more like uncertainty. Holt, she noticed, had not moved from near the nursing station, but he had stopped making phone calls and was watching the ER with a different quality of attention. The attention of a man recalculating something. She didn't have time to care about what either of them was thinking. "Bay assignments," she said to the room. "Bays 1 through 3 for immediate, 4 through 7 for delayed. 8 is surgical holding. I need a nurse paired to each bay. If you don't have a physician assigned to your bay, you start assessment and you call for backup. Don't wait for permission. Every bay running simultaneously the moment that first vehicle clears the entrance. Questions?" One of the residents, a young man she didn't know well, 2nd year, Ernest, raised his hand slightly. "I've never run mass casualty triage before." "Neither had I the first time," Mara said. "You'll know more than you think you know. Trust your training and call for backup when you're over your head. That's the whole job right now." She looked at him directly. "You're going to be fine. Move." He moved. Outside, somewhere beyond the parking structure, she could hear it. The low mechanical groan of heavy vehicles, the kind with diesel engines and weight that made the pavement vibrate. They were close. Closer than 9 minutes, which meant the dispatch estimate had been conservative, or the convoy had been pushing hard, or both. "Needle decompression kits to the door," she said to nobody in particular, and everybody at once. Now. The first vehicle came in fast. Not recklessly. These were professional drivers, military trained, but with the urgency of people who understood exactly what another 60 seconds meant. The convoy pulled into the ambulance bay in tight formation, and the back doors of the lead vehicle were already open before the vehicle fully stopped, 2 medics stepping down with a stretcher between them before the tires had finished moving. The man on the stretcher was big, well over 200 pounds of muscle and gear, face gray, breathing in the labored, asymmetric pattern that Mara recognized before she was close enough to see it clearly. Tension pneumo, left side. She had it diagnosed in the time it took to close the distance from the ER entrance to the ambulance bay. "Left side tension," she said to the medic on the right. "How long?" 22 minutes since symptom onset. We tried needle decompression in the field. Got flash, but it retensioned. Kinked catheter, she said. Not a question. Most likely. She had a 14-gauge needle in her hand. She didn't remember picking it up, but it was there, the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions making the decision for her hands faster than her conscious mind could. "Hold him still." The medic held. She found the landmark by feel, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and placed the needle. The rush of air was immediate, and the man's breathing shifted before she finished withdrawing. "Bay 1, she said. "Now." They were already moving. She didn't watch them go. The second vehicle was already disgorging patients, and the third was pulling into position, and the floor she had set up in the last 9 minutes was working. Bays staffed, carts positioned, the OR corridor open and lit and moving. She could feel the ER functioning the way an ER was supposed to function in a mass casualty event. The parts coordinating because someone had coordinated them, the system running because someone had built the system in the minutes before it was needed. It wasn't perfect. Nothing this complicated was ever perfect. Bay 5 had a supply gap she spotted from across the room and had Priya running to fix. One of the medics from the second vehicle was trying to argue with a resident about a medication decision, taking 30 seconds that nobody could afford, and Mara crossed the room and resolved it in 8 words. He's right. Do what the medic says. Go. But the overall shape of the operation was holding. Garrison Holt was standing near the entrance watching her. She didn't look at him long enough to read his expression. The fourth vehicle in the convoy had stopped at an unusual angle, and one of the National Guard medics was waving her over with a specific urgency that she had learned a long time ago meant something different from ordinary urgency. She crossed the bay. The back of the vehicle held 3 patients who had clearly been the most critical of the group. 2 of them were already tagged for direct surgical transfer. The third was a woman, late 20s, in a uniform Mara didn't immediately recognize, with a head wound that was bleeding in the controlled, pulsing way that indicated arterial involvement near the surface. The woman was conscious, barely. She kept refusing treatment, the medic said, dropping his voice. Kept saying, let the others go first. We had to physically restrain her from trying to help the others. Mara leaned in. What's your name? The woman's eyes focused slowly. Sergeant Lena Morse. Sergeant Morse, I'm Mara. You're at Harlow General. You're going to be fine, but I need you to stop trying to get up. A pause. The others are being taken care of, right now. Mara held eye contact. Every one of them. That's already happening. Your job right now is to be a patient. Can you do that? Something shifted in the woman's face. The trained resistance, the instinct to defer her own need running headlong into the clarity of Mara's voice and losing. Yeah, Sergeant Morse said, and stopped trying to sit up. Mara got the arterial bleed controlled in under 90 seconds. Direct pressure, correct angle, the kind of intervention that looked simple and wasn't, and had Morse flagged for priority imaging before handing her off to one of the nurses. She stood up from the crouch and turned back toward the ER. Stuart Farwell was standing 6 feet away. He wasn't on the phone. He wasn't arguing. He was watching her with an expression she had seen before on the faces of people who had made assumptions about someone and were in the process of revising them at speed. The expression wasn't comfortable for anyone who wore it. She walked past him without speaking. By 5:30, the initial wave was stabilized. Not resolved. The OR was running hard, 3 simultaneous procedures, and the delayed treatment group was working through assessment, but the immediate threat of mass casualties arriving faster than the hospital could absorb them had been met and managed. The floor was still moving, still loud, but it had the controlled loudness of a system functioning rather than the chaotic loudness of a system failing. Mara was at the central workstation running through patient status when one of the National Guard medics approached her. He was a broad man in his 40s with a name tape that read Dolores, and he had the seasoned, evaluating look of someone who had worked field medicine for a long time. Who set up your triage system? He asked. I did. He nodded slowly. You run mass casualty before? She glanced at him. Some. He seemed to weigh that. You ran it like someone who's done it for real, not just training. He paused. Some of the men, when they were coming in, a few of them were asking about you, not by your name, but by your... He stopped. Never mind. It's nothing. What were they asking? Dolores looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. They kept asking if Phoenix was here. He said it carefully, watching her face. I told them I didn't know who that was. They seemed relieved, maybe. Hard to read. Like it mattered to them whether or not Phoenix was involved, whether or not Phoenix was on the floor. Mara didn't change expression. I'm just a nurse, she said. Dolores nodded again, but he didn't look entirely like he believed her. She turned back to the workstation. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was something she had learned to maintain, not something that had come naturally, the capacity to perform under conditions that broke composure, to stay inside the clinical moment when everything external was chaos, to be the still point around which other people could orient themselves. She had learned it in places that Harlow General, Montana, would never see. From across the room, she could feel Holt's attention on her like a change in air pressure. She hadn't spoken to him since the convoy arrived. She hadn't needed to. Whatever was happening in his head, it wasn't her immediate problem. The patients were her immediate problem, and the patients were, for now, alive. The radio on the desk crackled again, and this time the voice was different. Not the National Guard medical coordinator, but someone higher in the chain, someone whose tone had the careful precision of authority that wasn't accustomed to explaining itself. Harlow General, this is Colonel Raymond Voss, Office of Special Operations Medical Command. We have additional personnel incoming with federal investigators attached. Please ensure your trauma coordinator is available for a direct briefing at time of arrival. Do not initiate any administrative changes to patient records or care assignments pending our arrival. The ER went quiet. Mara set down the chart she was holding. Farwell, across the room, turned toward her with an expression that had moved past uncertainty and arrived somewhere close to alarm. Holt's face had gone a particular shade of still that she recognized from her years in operational settings. The stillness of a man who had just heard something that made him realize the situation was considerably larger than he had understood it to be. The radio didn't crackle again. In the sudden quiet of Harlow General's ER, with 87 soldiers stabilized in rooms and bays throughout the building, with the OR running and the monitors beeping and the whole floor moving in the controlled rhythm she had set in motion 45 minutes ago, Mara Dowell pressed her fingertips flat on the workstation surface and waited. She didn't know yet exactly what Colonel Voss was bringing with him, but the way Garrison Holt's face looked right now, she was becoming increasingly certain that whatever it was, it had been building for a long time. Colonel Raymond Voss arrived at 5:51 in the morning, and he did not arrive alone. 3 black vehicles pulled into the ambulance bay with the kind of deliberate spacing that said these were people who had thought about sight lines. 2 of them were standard federal SUVs, but the third was a military transport with government plates and a communications antenna on the roof that suggested it was doing more than transporting people. 6 individuals in civilian clothes stepped out of the first 2 vehicles. 4 uniformed personnel stepped out of the third. All 10 moved with the economy of motion that came from years of training, and none of them looked at the hospital building the way civilians looked at hospitals, with uncertainty, with the faint anxiety of unfamiliar territory. They looked at it the way assessors looked at a site. Cataloging. Measuring. Voss himself was the last out. He was 60 or near it, lean in the way of someone who had maintained a physical discipline across decades, with silver hair cropped close and a face that had been weathered into something harder than age alone could account for. He wore a uniform with the kind of quiet precision that said the uniform was not a costume for him but a working reality. He stood in the ambulance bay for approximately 4 seconds, taking in the scene, the vehicles, the personnel moving through the entrance, the controlled activity visible through the glass. And then he walked inside. Mara was watching from the central workstation when he entered. She noticed 2 things immediately. First, Voss moved through the ER the way people move through spaces they intended to control, not by asserting himself loudly, but by the quality of his attention, the way his gaze moved across the room in a pattern that was clearly functional rather than merely curious. He was reading the floor, assessing the triage setup, the bay assignments, the patient distribution. Second, one of the soldiers who had come in with the convoy, a compact man in his early 30s who was being monitored in Bay 3 for a shrapnel wound to the upper arm, turned his head when Voss entered, and something passed between them that was less a greeting than a recognition, wordless and immediate. 2 of the federal agents in civilian clothes peeled off towards the nursing station and badged the duty clerk without introduction. She watched them request patient records and heard the clerk's muffled, uncertain response. Voss stopped 3 feet from her workstation. "You're the trauma coordinator," he said. "Not a question." Mara Dowell, nursing staff. "Colonel Raymond Voss, I'm told you ran the triage operation from the initial mobilization." "Someone had to." He looked at her for a moment, and whatever the look meant, it wasn't dismissal. "Walk me through the breakdown, numbers, presentations, current status." She walked him through it without hesitation, the way she would have briefed a superior officer in a different life, concise, sequential, nothing omitted, and nothing padded. 87 incoming, 30 immediate, 40 delayed, 17 expectant but salvageable. All 30 immediate stabilized within 22 minutes of the first vehicle arriving, or currently running 3 simultaneous procedures, 4 patients under post-operative monitoring. The delayed group fully assessed and distributed. No mortality on the floor. When she finished, Voss was quiet for a moment. No mortality, he said. Not yet. 2 of the post-surgical cases are still high risk. But as of right now. He made a small sound that wasn't quite approval and wasn't quite surprise. Something between them. That's not the outcome our medical coordinator projected when the convoy routed here. The projection was 17 to 22 fatalities given hospital capacity. The projection assumed the hospital wouldn't mobilize correctly, Mara said. The projection assumed standard response time and standard coordination, he said, which is what this facility's record suggested. He looked around the ER. Apparently the record was incomplete. From across the room she felt Garrison Holt approach, and a moment later he was beside her, or beside Voss more precisely, inserting himself into the conversation with the smoothness of a man accustomed to controlling access. Colonel Voss, I'm Garrison Holt, hospital director. On behalf of Harlow General, I want to assure you that our team performed admirably under very difficult... Mr. Holt, Voss didn't look at him. I'll speak with you shortly. Right now I'm speaking with Ms. Dowell. Holt stopped. The sentence had been delivered without heat, which somehow made it more final than anger would have. Mara kept her face neutral. I have some additional questions, Voss said to her. Can you spare 20 minutes? She glanced at the floor, at the monitors, the bay activity, Priya moving between patients with the focused efficiency of someone who had grown into her role over the last 90 minutes in ways that couldn't be manufactured. I can spare 15. Something in Voss's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, not quite amusement. 15 is fine. Well, they used the trauma consultation room off the main corridor, a small room with a table and chairs and a wall-mounted screen that was currently dark. One of the federal agents, a woman named Delaney who had said nothing since arriving and seemed to prefer it that way, sat in the corner with a tablet and took notes without appearing to take notes. Voss sat across from Mara and placed a folder on the table between them. He didn't open it. Tell me about the vehicle, he said. She didn't understand that immediately. Which vehicle? Bay 4. Third vehicle in the convoy. One of the medics reported that when it arrived, you made a specific request for patient status before approaching. You asked for the number of expectant but salvageable, then asked about the largest vehicle. Then you directed the corridor clearance. He paused. The medic said it looked like you'd run this specific scenario before. I've run mass casualty scenarios before. 87 wounded with that specific injury distribution isn't a standard scenario. She looked at him. I read the injury profile from the radio transmission and made decisions based on it. That's triage. Voss opened the folder. The top sheet was a form she recognized in its general structure, the kind of administrative document that existed in the overlap between military records and federal clearance systems. The specific content she couldn't read from her angle, but the header and formatting were familiar. I'm going to tell you what I know, Voss said, and I'd appreciate it if you'd tell me what I'm wrong about. He looked at her steadily. We believe the convoy was targeted, not ambushed at the operational site. That's a different situation, but specifically routed toward this hospital because someone believed this hospital's response would be inadequate. Someone who knew the response would be inadequate. The room was very quiet. The original routing had the convoy going to Millbrook Regional, he continued. Millbrook has a Level 1 trauma center and a standing agreement with SOCOM for exactly this kind of event. The routing was changed 4 hours before the convoy departed. It was changed by a communications intercept that identified Harlow General as the designated facility. He paused. The intercept was false. Someone generated it deliberately. Mara absorbed that. Someone wanted the convoy here because they expected the outcome to be worse. The projection, as I said, was 17 to 22 fatalities. In a mass casualty event of that scale, those deaths are a statement. His voice remained flat and factual. We need to understand who generated that intercept and why. And we need to understand whether this hospital's inadequate response was something they knew about in advance or something they arranged in advance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop slightly. "You're saying someone inside the hospital may have been involved," Mara said. "I'm saying we're not ruling it out." He closed the folder. "The administrative decision to pull your trauma rotation this morning, that was Holt and Farwell, personnel action. Made at 4:09 a.m., Delaney said from the corner. First word she'd spoken. Convoy was rerouted at 3:47 a.m. 22 minutes. Mara sat with that for a moment, arranging the sequence in her head. The rerouting happened before Holt pulled her from trauma duty, which meant the rerouting hadn't been a response to her removal. But the timing was close enough to suggest that both events had been set in motion by a common knowledge, that Harlow General, without its most experienced trauma coordinator, would not be able to handle this. Someone had known she would be removed, or someone had ensured she would be removed. "I need to ask you something," Voss said, "and I need you to be direct with me." "I'm generally direct," she said. "The men in the convoy. Several of them were asking for someone when they came in, using a call sign." He watched her face. "Phoenix." The name settled in the room like something physical. Mara looked at the table surface, then at Voss. "I left the service 4 years ago." "I know. I've read your file." "Then you know more than I'm going to tell you in 15 minutes. I know you spent 6 years as a Special Operations Combat Medic attached to units that don't have official names, and that your record includes casualty management in field conditions that would have broken most people, and that you separated under circumstances that your commanding officer at the time described in the debrief as, he glanced at the folder, the single largest individual contribution to unit survival in the theater, his words. He set the folder down. "You came to a rural hospital in Montana and filed it under trauma nursing. Why?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because it's what I wanted to do. People who serve the way you served don't usually want quiet. Maybe I wanted something different. Did you get it?" She looked at him. "I was pulled from trauma rotation this morning by a hospital director trying to manage a personnel complaint. So no, not entirely." Something moved across Voss's face. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. "I need to ask you to go back to the floor." "I'm already on the floor." "I need you there with authority. Not the authority you took this morning, which was the right call, but which is going to get complicated unless we give it a foundation." He folded his hands on the table. "What I'm about to tell you is being communicated to hospital administration simultaneously. Harlow General is being formally designated as a federal medical facility for the duration of this event. Federal medical authority supersedes hospital administrative authority during a designated event, which means Garrison Holt does not have the standing to reassign you, discipline you, or remove you from any clinical role while the designation is active." Mara stared at him. "How long does that take?" "It happened 11 minutes ago," Delaney said from the corner. The ER had changed while Mara was in the consultation room. Not dramatically. The patients were in the same places, the monitors running the same numbers. But the atmosphere had shifted in the particular way that happened when authority had moved without anyone announcing it. The federal agents at the nursing station had spread out. The uniformed personnel from the convoy had taken positions near 2 of the trauma bays, not threateningly, but with the relaxed alertness of people who had been told to stay present and were staying present. Several of the nurses were moving with slightly more confidence than they'd had before, which suggested word had gotten around through the channels that word always traveled in hospitals, sideways, quietly, faster than any official announcement. Holt was near the entrance to the trauma corridor, speaking in a low voice to Stuart Farwell. When Mara came through from the consultation room, both of them stopped speaking and looked at her. Holt straightened. "Ms. Dowell, I need to—" "I've been informed about the federal designation," she said, without slowing down. "If you need to speak with Colonel Voss about it, he's in consultation room 2. She moved past them toward the central workstation. Behind her, she heard Farwell say something, low and sharp. She didn't catch the words, and it didn't matter. She checked the monitors, ran through the patient update that Priya gave her in a tight 90-second briefing. One of the post-surgical cases had stabilized further, the other remained marginal. 2 of the delayed group patients had been upgraded to immediate following imaging, and was in the middle of adjusting the Bay 8 assignment when she became aware that someone was standing near her who wasn't staff. She looked up. I was in his mid-30s with the build of someone who had been at peak physical conditioning not too long ago and whose body still held the architecture of it even through what was clearly significant recent trauma. His left arm was in a field dressing that someone had applied cleanly, which told her he'd been treated by someone competent. His face had 3 days of beard and the gray cast of someone who hadn't slept, and his eyes, when they met hers, had an expression she had seen before, in a specific kind of person, in specific kinds of circumstances. She had seen that look on the faces of people who had survived something they hadn't expected to survive. "Sergeant Dowell," he said. She kept her expression neutral. "Nurse Dowell." "Right." He didn't look convinced. "I'm Staff Sergeant Reeves. Danny Reeves. 3rd Squadron, attached." He paused. "I was in the Corrivan Valley. November, 3 years ago." The name of the valley moved through her like a current, but she kept her face where it was. "I'm in the middle of a shift," she said. "I know, He stopped, recalibrated. "I wanted to say something to the person who ran triage tonight." He looked at the ER, at the bays, at the organized activity. "Whoever set this up did it correctly. I've been in a lot of aid stations. I've been through a lot of bad nights. This is..." He seemed to run out of words that satisfied him. "I wanted somebody to know I noticed." She looked at him for a moment. He was trying to keep his voice level and mostly managing it. "You should be in your bay," she said. "That arm needs a proper dressing change in about 3 hours. Make sure you're there." He looked at her a beat longer than was comfortable, then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He went back to his bay. Mara turned back to the workstation and made a notation in the care log, and if her hand moved slightly slower than usual for the length of one breath, nobody was close enough to notice. The incident with the vehicle happened at 6:34. One of the uniformed personnel near the ambulance entrance came onto the radio at a controlled pitch that still carried the texture of urgency. "Vehicle approaching from the North Access Road, unknown plate, not matching any registered convoy or support vehicle, moving at reduced speed but not stopping at the perimeter marker." Mara was at the workstation. She processed it in about a second and a half. "Clear the ambulance bay," she said. Not a question, not a request. She was already moving toward the entrance, already tracking where the patients near the windows were, already running the math on blast radius versus the building's structural points. From across the ER, Holt's voice. "What is she? What's happening?" She ignored it. "Everyone move away from the ambulance entrance. Patients in bays 1 and 2 move to the interior wall. Now." She reached the charge desk and picked up the overhead intercom without asking anyone's permission. "All staff, all patients. Move to interior positions away from the north-facing ambulance bay. This is not a drill." The ER moved. Not perfectly. 2 nurses froze for half a second before Priya's voice cut through and got them moving. But it moved. "Dowell." Holt was behind her now, his voice clipped with the particular anger of a man who had been overridden twice in one morning. "You do not have the authority to initiate a building evacuation." "I'm not initiating an evacuation. I'm moving people away from a potential blast point." "Based on what?" "Based on a vehicle that isn't stopping at the perimeter." She turned to face him. "If I'm wrong, you can write me up. Get away from that window." He didn't move. She looked at him for one full second, decided she had done what she could do, and turned back to the entrance. The explosion came 11 seconds later. It was not inside the building. The vehicle had stopped approximately 40 meters from the ambulance entrance, either a timing failure or something in the perimeter approach the driver hadn't accounted for. And when it detonated, the force came through the entrance glass as a compression wave, blowing the bay doors inward and shaking the ceiling fixtures hard enough that 2 of them came loose. A fireball was visible through the shattered glass, orange and black against the pre-dawn dark. And then the secondary sound followed, lower, rolling, the kind that you felt in your chest. In the ER interior, where everyone had moved, there was a beat of complete silence. Then monitors began alarming as the power fluctuated, and the backup generators kicked in with a thud that Mara felt through the floor. And from somewhere she could hear a nurse saying something urgent and controlled. And from somewhere else she heard Priya's voice, calm and clear above the alarms. "Everyone stay down. Wait for the all clear." Mara was already on her feet. She hadn't been knocked down. She'd been positioned against an interior wall and had braced when she heard the vehicle stop at the wrong distance. She did a visual sweep of the ER. Everyone present, No one near the entrance when it went. The bay doors were compromised and there was glass on the floor near the entrance, and one of the monitoring screens near Bay 1 had been knocked off its mount, but the patients in the bays, moved to interior walls on her instruction, were intact. She crossed the room to where Holt was. I was on the floor near the window he hadn't moved away from. Not seriously injured, she assessed that immediately. But he had been close enough to the entrance when the compression wave hit that it had knocked him backward into the wall, and he was sitting with his back against it and a cut above his left ear that was bleeding with the enthusiasm that scalp wounds always brought. His expression was a specific kind of blank that she recognized as shock. She crouched in front of him. "Holt, look at me." He looked at her, his eyes focused. "Are you hurt anywhere besides the head?" He touched his ear, looked at the blood on his fingers. "I don't think so." "Can you feel your hands and feet?" "Yes." "Okay." She waved Priya over. "Scalp black, possible concussion. Get him assessed." She stood up. On the other side of the room, Colonel Voss was on a radio. His voice was flat and rapid, the kind of communication that was dense with information and stripped of everything unnecessary, and she caught fragments of it. Perimeter breach, secondary device potential, federal response incoming. Before he looked across the room and found her, and for a moment their eyes met across the controlled chaos of the ER. He gave her a single nod. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but it wasn't nothing. The federal agents had shifted from observer mode into something more active, two of them near the entrance with weapons drawn, another on a radio running a sweep pattern around the perimeter. The uniformed personnel had automatically moved to patient protective positions near the bays without being told. The machinery of a different kind of response had engaged itself around the bones of the triage operation she'd built, and the fact that the two things were compatible, that her setup had given it something to work around, wasn't something she had time to think about. She went back to the workstation. Patient status first. Everything else was someone else's problem. By 7 o'clock, the perimeter was secured, the ambulance bay was cordoned with federal tape, and a third wave of personnel had arrived from the National Guard installation 12 miles north. The hospital was no longer just a medical facility managing a mass casualty event. It was something else, something that didn't have a clean name yet, a crime scene and an active care environment at the same time. The two things running in parallel with an awkwardness that Mara could feel in the tension of every nurse on the floor. She was reviewing imaging results from Bay 6 when Reeves appeared beside her again. "I heard you cleared the bay," he said. "I did." "Before the explosion?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You heard something in the radio report. Something that told you." "The vehicle wasn't stopping," she said. "Reduced speed that wasn't becoming stopped speed. It meant either the driver was lost, which doesn't match the access road geometry, or the vehicle wasn't going to stop. Most people would have waited to be sure." "Most people would have been closer to the entrance when it went off," she said. Another pause. "Caravan Valley," he said, not quite a question. "November." She kept her eyes on the imaging screen. "I was a medic in a different unit," he said. "We heard about it after. What happened with the Cassavac that night? The medic who kept 14 men alive with a kit that was supposed to be for 6. He paused. "They gave her a call sign. The operators talked about it for months." "Lots of medics do good work in bad conditions," Mara said. "Not like that." She closed the imaging file, opened the next. Her throat was doing something she didn't appreciate, a tightening that she associated with a specific kind of emotion she had spent considerable energy learning to manage. Not grief exactly, something adjacent to it. The weight of a version of herself she had put down and sometimes could still feel the shape of. "You need to get back to your bay," she said. "Dressing change in—" She glanced at the clock. 90 minutes. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, same as before. This time, before he walked away, he said one more thing, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "For what it's worth, some of us have been hoping you were okay since you separated." He paused. "Didn't know where you went. Didn't know if you were—" He stopped. "Anyway, we're glad you're here." He walked back to his bay. Mara stood at the workstation for a moment. The monitors beeped around her. Somewhere in Bay 3, a patient was asking for water. 2 of the federal agents were moving through the corridor with clipboards. Priya was on the phone with the OR, voice low and precise, asking about post-op status. Mara pressed her fingers to the edge of the desk and breathed. She was still standing there, still and quiet inside the noise of everything, when Delaney appeared at her left elbow. "Colonel Voss needs you," Delaney said. "Something's come up with the hospital's communications logs from last night." "What specifically?" Delaney glanced around the room, the brief, careful look of someone managing information in a space that wasn't controlled. "The convoy rerouting communication, the one that redirected them here from Millbrook." She paused. "Our technical team pulled the origin trace. It didn't come from outside the hospital." Mara went still. "The signal that redirected 87 wounded soldiers to a facility that wasn't equipped to handle them," Delaney said, keeping her voice below the ambient noise, "originated from a device registered to this hospital's internal communications network. The ER continued its controlled activity around them." "Who's the device registered to?" Mara asked. Delaney looked at her steadily. "It's registered to the office of the hospital director," she said. The words landed and didn't move. Mara stood at the workstation with the ambient noise of the ER running around her. Monitors, voices, the squeak of a cartwheel on linoleum. And she held the information still in her mind the way she had been trained to hold any piece of intelligence that changed the shape of a situation. Not reacting to it immediately, letting it settle into the existing picture until she could see what it displaced and what it confirmed. The rerouting signal had come from a device registered to the office of the hospital director, which meant either Garrison Holt had deliberately redirected a convoy of critically wounded soldiers to a facility he knew couldn't adequately receive them, or someone with access to his office's communication infrastructure had done it and made it look like him. The distinction mattered, but it mattered less in this moment than the operational reality. Someone inside this building had been involved in what had happened tonight, and that person was either currently being treated for a scalp laceration in Bay 4 or was still moving freely through the hospital. "Does Holt know you've traced it?" Mara asked. "Not yet," Delaney said. "Voss is managing the disclosure timeline." "Where's Holt right now?" "Bay 4, under medical observation." "And Farwell?" Delaney's expression shifted, just slightly. "That's the other thing Voss wants to talk to you about." The consultation room felt smaller the second time. Voss was standing rather than sitting, which told her the conversation had changed register from briefing to operational. Delaney took her corner again. A third person was present now. A man in his late 40s with federal credentials and the particular stillness of someone from an investigative background, introduced as Special Agent Carver from the Office of Special Investigations. He had a face that gave nothing away and a yellow legal pad covered in handwriting that he kept turned slightly away from the table's center. "Farwell," Voss said, before Mara had fully settled. "What about him?" "He left the building at 6:41, approximately 7 minutes after the vehicle detonated." Voss set a printed page on the table, a time-stamped security log from the hospital's exterior camera system. "He told the nurse on duty he was going to his car for a personal item. He has not returned." Mara looked at the log. 41:17. Farwell, Stuart R., through the staff exit on the building's east side, the opposite side from the ambulance bay. "He went out the side that wasn't on fire," she said. "He went out the side with the least federal presence," Carver said. She looked at the image on the log, a grainy still from the exterior camera, Farwell in a coat, moving with the purposeful speed of someone who had somewhere to be and had been waiting for a moment to go there. Not running. That was the tell. People who panicked ran. People who planned walked quickly. "What's his background?" she asked. "Outside this hospital." Carver flipped a page on his legal pad. "Farwell did a residency at Harlow General 12 years ago, left for a private practice group in Seattle, came back 6 years ago when Holt brought him in as trauma chief. Before medical school, he did 2 years at a defense contractor called Meridian Health Systems, working in their emergency logistics division." "Meridian," Mara said. Voss looked at her. "You know them." "I know the name. They had a contract with SOCOM for field medical supply chain during my second deployment. There were internal reviews about cost manipulation. Nothing public." She paused. "I didn't know they had a civilian hospital division." "They don't anymore," Carver said. "Meridian dissolved their health systems branch 4 years ago under a federal investigation that didn't conclude because the primary witness relocated to an undisclosed location." He paused. "One of Meridian's secondary contracts was for emergency routing software used by military medical convoys." The pieces were assembling themselves with the cold logic of something that had been in motion long before this morning. Someone with access to Meridian's old routing architecture, Mara said slowly, could have known how to generate a communications intercept that looked like an authentic military medical redirect. Could have, Voss said. And someone with administrative access to this hospital's communication infrastructure could have transmitted it from inside the building in a way that would be harder to trace. Two people, she said, or one person who had both. Or one person who had one and access to the other, Carver said. Farwell had the technical background and the Meridian connection. Holt controlled the infrastructure. Whether they were working together or one of them was using the other without full knowledge is what we're currently determining. Mara sat back. The picture was large and getting larger, and the part of her that had spent 6 years operating in environments where the full picture was rarely visible and decisions had to be made anyway was already running forward of the current information to the places it logically led. "There's a patient in Bay 3, she said. Reeves. Staff Sergeant Reeves. He mentioned Meridian's name to another patient during assessment. I didn't think it was significant at the time, but he was asking about the convoy rerouting, asking why they'd been sent here." She paused. "He may know more about the operational context of what happened before they arrived." Voss looked at Delaney. Delaney was already moving toward the door. "Ms. Dowell," Voss said as Mara stood. "One more thing. Before you go back to the floor." He held her gaze for a moment. "The soldiers who are asking about Phoenix, I'm not going to pretend I don't know what that is. I've read enough of your file to understand the operational history." His voice didn't change. "I'm also not going to make an issue of the fact that you separated under a name change administrative request and have been working under your given name rather than a call sign." "I separated cleanly," she said. "I know you did. I'm not questioning that." He paused. "I'm telling you that whatever decisions you made when you left the service this morning has made them complicated. People in this building, some of them federal agents, some of them wounded operators, know who you are. And what you did in the last 3 hours has made it considerably harder to keep that compartmentalized." She looked at him. "I didn't do anything this morning to be recognized. I did it because patients were going to die." "I know that too." A pause. "I just want you to be prepared, because the conversation about your record is going to happen whether you participate in it or not." She picked up her badge from the table where she'd set it and clipped it back to her scrubs. "Patients first," she said. "Everything else can wait." The ER at 7:15 in this morning had the particular exhausted quality of a system that had been running at maximum capacity for 2 hours and was beginning to feel the edges of it. Not failing, the numbers were still good, the monitoring solid, the 2 highest risk post-surgical cases holding their trajectories within acceptable parameters. But the staff were tired in a way that showed in small things. A slower response to a monitor alarm. A medication check that took 15 seconds longer than it should. The accumulated weight of sustained high-intensity work settling into the muscles and the decision-making both. Mara saw it and adjusted. She pulled 2 nurses from the delayed treatment group to cover the immediate bays, rotating the staff who had been on the floor since before the convoy arrived. She called the duty roster and got 2 additional nurses in from the off shift, framing it as a stand extension, which it technically was. She asked Priya to take a 30-minute break, not a suggestion, a direction. And Priya argued briefly and then went, because even good nurses with good instincts needed someone to override their stubbornness on their behalf sometimes. She was in the middle of rebalancing the bay assignments when one of the federal agents, not Delaney, a younger man she didn't know, came to her with a question she hadn't expected. "The patient in Bay 7, he said, "the one listed as Warrant Officer Dax Tremaine, he's been asking to speak with the trauma coordinator." "About his care?" "About something that happened before the convoy left." She finished the notation she was writing and set the clipboard down. "I'll go." Bay 7 was quieter than the others. Tremaine was in his 40s, with a broad face and a broken nose that had been broken at least twice before based on the way it sat. His right leg was immobilized and elevated following a below-knee fracture that had been set by one of the surgical team 2 hours earlier. He was alert, more alert than most people looked with a fresh fracture, which told her his pain tolerance was calibrated differently than the civilian average. And when she came in, he looked at her with the immediate, assessing attention of someone who had been waiting. "You're Dowell," he said. "I am." "Sit down." Then catching himself, please. She sat. She had maybe 10 minutes before the floor needed her attention again, and she knew it, but she also knew the look on his face, the compressed urgency of someone carrying information they'd been waiting for the right moment to deliver. Before we departed, Tremaine said, there was a briefing about the rerouting. Someone told our convoy commander that Millbrook was at capacity. Mass casualty event from a highway accident. No trauma space available. We took it at face value because the source was a medical liaison officer, an individual who had been attached to our command for about 3 weeks. He stopped. I didn't recognize him. Didn't think much of it at the time. We had other concerns. He looked at his leg. After the explosion outside, after I heard what the investigators were saying, I started thinking about that liaison, about the way the briefing had been structured, the specific language. Mara waited. He used a phrase, Tremaine said, in the briefing. When he was describing Millbrook's capacity issue, he said they had a routing accommodation failure, not an overflow, not a capacity problem. A routing accommodation failure. He paused. That's Meridian terminology. That's the specific language from their emergency logistics manual. I know because I did a joint exercise with a Meridian contracted facility 8 years ago, and it was in all their documentation. His voice was controlled, but underneath it she could hear the particular anger of a man who realized he had missed something important. Whoever that liaison was, he had Meridian training. Did you get a name? Gave his name as Major Philip Tate. I've since been informed there is no Major Philip Tate in any personnel directory our investigators can access. Description? Tremaine gave it, 50-ish, medium-old, gray at the temples, a slight scar along the left jawline. Spoke with precision. Had a familiarity with the facility layout that Tremaine had attributed at the time to prior site visits. The description didn't match Farwell exactly. Farwell was younger, no visible scarring, but it matched the profile of someone in Farwell's network. Someone Farwell could have coached, or someone Farwell was working through. I need to give this to the investigators, she said. I know. I'm giving it to you first because... He stopped. Looked at the ceiling for a moment. There are men in this hospital who are alive because of what happened in this ER tonight. And those men told me what they told the medic, about who was running things when they came in. He brought his gaze back to her. I wanted you to have it first, before it became part of a federal report, because you earned that. She held his gaze for a moment. Didn't thank him, because in her experience, the men who said things like this didn't need thanks. They needed the information acted on. I'll get this to Carver, she said, and stood. The second critical escalation came from the direction she hadn't been watching. At 7:43, the OR called down with a status that stopped the floor. The patient in the second highest risk post-surgical case, a petty officer named Marcus Webb, who had come in with a penetrating abdominal injury and had been in surgery for just under 90 minutes, had developed an intraoperative complication that the attending surgeon, a civilian general surgeon named Dr. Raya Totten, who had been working since midnight and was now into her 7th hour, had identified as a splenic artery bleed that had been initially controlled but had begun to rebleed following the primary closure. We need a vascular surgeon, Totten's voice said over the OR phone, and she was keeping it level with the same effort that Mara recognized from her own attempts to keep clinical urgency out of her voice in bad moments. Our vascular surgery attending is currently in surgery on the primary case and cannot be pulled. Do you have any options? Mara was at the central station with the phone in her hand. What's your time window? 20 minutes? Maybe less. The bleeding is controlled right now, but it's not going to stay that way. 20 minutes to find a vascular surgeon in a rural Montana hospital at 8 in the morning. She looked at the room. The federal presence had actually, she realized, given her something she wouldn't have had otherwise. A room full of military medical personnel, some of whom were not themselves injured. Hold, she told Totten, and put the phone down. She crossed the ER in 12 steps to where Medic Dolores was standing near the corridor entrance. You told me you've been in field medicine for a long time. 22 years, he said. What's your vascular experience? He read her immediately. I'm not a surgeon. I'm not asking you to operate. I'm asking if you've assisted in vascular repair. Field expedient, yes. Operating room. He paused. 3 times. 2 with a SOCOM surgeon, 1 solo under radio guidance. I have a splenic artery rebleed in the OR. The surgeon has vascular training, but her hands are full and she needs someone who has seen this before. She looked at him directly. If you're willing. He didn't hesitate more than 2 seconds. Lead me. She got back on the phone with Totten. I have a field medic with vascular assist experience. He's not a surgeon, but he's seen splenic artery repair in field conditions, and he can assist if you walk him through it. A pause on the other end that lasted about 4 seconds. Send him up, Totten said. Mara had Dolores scrubbed and moving within 90 seconds, and she was back at the central station before she had time to think about whether it was the right call. Because thinking about whether it was the right call was a luxury she didn't have, and in her experience, the right call was usually the one that kept someone alive long enough for the ideal solution to become available. At 7:58, the floor shifted again. Delaney came through the main entrance at a pace that wasn't quite running but was close, and the expression on her face was one that Mara had learned to recognize in people who worked in federal investigations and encountered something that broke their professional composure. Not fear, but a specific recalibration, the look of someone who had received information that changed the map. They found Farwell, Delaney said. Where? The National Guard installation, 12 miles north. I was attempting to access the communications center at the installation using a military ID that doesn't belong to him. She paused. He's in custody, but that's not the issue. What's the issue? When they searched his vehicle, they found a laptop. Encrypted, but our team is working through it. She looked around the room and lowered her voice further. There's a directory on the drive. Names, dates, facility information. And Mara, some of those names are patients in this hospital right now. The ER hummed around them, monitors and voices, and the ordinary sounds of a floor that was functioning. Mara stood very still. He has a target list, she said. We don't know that yet. We don't know what the directory is for, but the timing, the vehicle this morning, the fact that he was heading to a communications center, Delaney pressed her lips together. If there's a secondary component to whatever this is, we need to know whether it's already in motion. Mara's mind moved through the floor. 87 patients. A building that had been breached once this morning by a vehicle from the North Access Road. Federal presence at the perimeter, but the perimeter was not small. A hospital campus with multiple access points. A parking structure that she had never seen fully secured in 3 years of working there. A loading dock on the south side that she was aware received deliveries at irregular hours and was monitored by a single camera that she happened to know had been flagged in the maintenance log for intermittent failure 6 weeks ago. She had flagged it herself, in a report to administration that had been acknowledged and not acted on. How many of your people can you redistribute to internal positions? She asked. I have 6 agents currently on internal assignment. I need the loading dock on the south side doubled. I need the stairwells on the east side covered, and I need eyes on the OR corridor, because if there's a target on that list who is currently in surgery, the access point that matters most is the floor above us, not this one. She was already moving, not away from Delaney, but toward the central station, toward the phone she needed. And I need Voss. He's on the phone with, tell him I need him in 30 seconds. Delaney went. Mara picked up the intercom phone and had a brief, precise conversation with the charge nurse on the OR floor. Reinforce your entrance. Do not admit anyone without federal agent escort. No exceptions, no matter what credentials they present. And then she turned back to the room and looked at it with the full attention she had not been able to give it since Delaney walked in, looking for anything that had changed, anyone who had moved differently in the last 3 minutes, anything that was not where it had been. The ER looked normal, which was either because it was normal or because she was looking at the wrong place. Voss came through from the consultation corridor at exactly the pace she would have moved if she were coming to a situation that required urgency and control simultaneously. She intercepted him near the nursing station and gave him the information in 40 seconds, no more. The same briefing structure she would have used in the field. What she knew, what she inferred, what she had done, what she needed. He listened without interrupting. The directory is being decrypted now, he said. We'll know the content in... We can't wait for the directory. If there's a secondary element, it's either already here or it's coming, and waiting for the content means we're reactive. Agreed. He looked at the room. What do you need that you don't have? I need someone covering the pharmacy, she said. If you're targeting patients who are already in a hospital, the most efficient vector isn't physical access. It's the medication system. Voss went still for a fraction of a second. The automated dispensing system, she said. This hospital uses a network dispensing system. Every bay, every floor. If someone with the right access wanted to introduce an error into the medication pipeline for specific patients, can they access it remotely? I don't know, but Farwell was the trauma chief. And the trauma chief has administrative access to the clinical system, including the dispensing network. She watched his face process it. He's been away from the building for just under an hour and a half. That's enough time. Voss had his radio out. She heard him say the word pharmacy and the word lockdown, and she turned away from the conversation because her floor needed her, and she had already done what she could do in this specific direction. She was at Bay 2 checking a medication line when Priya came back from her break, saw Mara's face, and said, "What happened?" "Possible medication system compromise. I need you to manually verify every active drip on the floor. Every one. Check it against the original order, check the label, check the rate. Don't use the electronic system for verification. Use the paper backup and your own eyes." Priya's face went very serious. "All of them. All of them. Now." Priya went. Mara moved to Bay 3 and started there herself, because Bay 3 was where Reeves was, and Reeves was in the category of people who had been asking questions about Meridian and about the convoy rerouting, and she had learned in a different life that the people who asked the right questions were frequently the ones someone wanted to stop from asking. She was verifying his secondary IV line, cross-referencing the label against the written order, when the medication pump on the adjacent unit alarmed with a code she recognized. A programming discrepancy flag, the pump detecting a mismatch between the ordered rate and the rate it had been set to deliver. The mismatch wasn't large. In an ordinary shift, on an ordinary day, it might have been attributed to a keying error, caught in the next round of checks, corrected without incident. She looked at the pump screen. The ordered rate for the patient in the adjacent bay, a young specialist named Torres, shrapnel wound, stable, was 75 milliliters per hour. The rate the pump had been set to deliver was 750 milliliters per hour. Not a keying error. A decimal point deliberately moved. At 750 milliliters per hour of the saline diluted anticoagulant running in Torres's line, the patient would have been in active hemorrhage within 40 minutes. She silenced the alarm, corrected the rate, and stood up. Her hands were not shaking. They didn't shake. But inside her chest there was something cold and focused and very, very angry, and she let herself feel it for exactly as long as it took to move to the next bay and check the next pump. Bay 5. Correct. Bay 6. Correct. Bay 7. Tremaine. She found a secondary fluid running from a bag that had not been there 30 minutes ago, hanging from a secondary hook on the IV stand, unlabeled, with a small handwritten notation on the tape that said supplement. Standard protocol in a handwriting she did not recognize. There was no supplement on Tremaine's order. She clamped the line before the bag could deliver another milliliter, pulled the bag from the hook, and held it up to the light. Clear fluid that could be almost anything. She set the bag carefully on the workstation tray, photographed it with the floor camera documentation system, and keyed the intercom. "I need Voss on the floor," she said, "and I need a federal evidence bag, right now." The response came back in under 10 seconds. But in the time between her call and the response, she heard something she hadn't heard in 3 years. Something that didn't belong in the sound profile of a hospital corridor. Something that her body recognized before her conscious mind finished identifying it. Footsteps. Moving fast and trying not to. On the stairwell, she had told Voss to cover, coming from above. She didn't wait for backup. Not because she thought backup was unnecessary. She had called for it. It was coming. That part was done. But because the time between the footsteps on the stairwell and the arrival of anyone who could respond was measured in seconds. And seconds in a hospital with compromised medication lines and a target list and a stairwell that was supposed to be covered were not units of time she could afford to spend standing still. She moved to the stairwell door at the end of the east corridor, positioned herself to the side of it rather than in front of it, a habit from a different life that she had never consciously decided to keep, but that her body maintained regardless, and pushed the door open with one hand while keeping her back to the wall. The stairwell was empty. Not silent. There was the ambient hum of the building's HVAC moving through the shaft, and the faint echo of someone moving somewhere above. But empty at this level, nothing coming down, nothing waiting at the landing. She listened. The footsteps she had heard were not continuing, they had stopped, or the person making them had changed their approach, which meant either she had been wrong about the direction, or whoever it was had heard her move to the door. She let the door close and turned back to the corridor. One of the federal agents, the younger man whose name she still didn't know, was coming from the main ER entrance at a half jog, hand near his jacket, in the way that wasn't quite reaching for anything but was aware of what was there. She shook her head once, the small, precise gesture that meant stand down but stay close, and he adjusted without needing it explained. Stairwell came back empty, she said, low. But I need someone on the OR floor access door. If whoever it was changed direction, that's where they went. He had his radio out before she finished the sentence. She went back to the floor. The unlabeled bag went to Carver in a federal evidence container at 8:11. He looked at it with the careful attention of someone who understood what it represented, asked her 2 questions. When did you first observe it? Did you see who placed it? And then took it without telling her what he intended to do with it next, which was appropriate because it wasn't her operation and she had enough of her own. Priya had finished her medication verification circuit by 8:19. 2 additional discrepancies found. One in Bay 1, a rate error similar to the Torres situation, caught before delivery, corrected, and one in Bay 9, where a patient's allergy flag had been cleared in the electronic system despite it existing in the paper record, which meant that if the automated dispensing had delivered his next scheduled dose without the paper cross-check, he would have received a medication his chart clearly indicated he could not tolerate. 3 deliberate errors in the medication system, all on patients from the convoy, all designed to look, at first pass, like the ordinary mistakes that happen in busy hospitals. All of them caught because Mara had ordered the manual cross-check 40 minutes ago. She stood at the central station with the paper record spread in front of her and thought about the mechanism of it. The errors hadn't been introduced through the automated dispensing hardware. The pumps had flagged the discrepancies, which meant the machine side of the system was working. The manipulation had been in the software layer, in the data that the system was reading to determine what to deliver and to whom. Someone had accessed the clinical data system and made targeted alterations to specific patients' orders and allergy flags. Farwell had administrative access to the clinical system, but Farwell had been in custody since 7:43, and the most recent error, the allergy flag clearance in Bay 9, had a timestamp in the system log of 8:03, 20 minutes after his arrest, which meant Farwell had not been alone in this. She picked up the nearest phone and called the IT administrator on duty, a man named Greer, whom she had spoken to exactly twice in 3 years, and who picked up sounding like someone who had been awake too long and was about to find out things were about to get worse. I need a complete access log for the clinical data system from midnight to now, she said. Every login, every record access, every modification, and I need the IP addresses for anything that accessed patient orders in the last 2 hours. A pause. That's a significant pull. I'd need authorization from, you have federal investigators on site. I need you to call Agent Carver at extension 4471 and get the authorization in the next 5 minutes, and then I need the log. Because there's been an active intrusion into patient medication records, and we have a timestamp from 8 minutes ago that postdates the arrest of the person we thought was responsible. A longer pause. Give me 4 minutes, Greer said, and the line clicked. Voss found her at the station 7 minutes later with the expression of a man who had received 3 pieces of bad news in quick succession and was managing them in order of severity. The directory on Farwell's laptop, he said, decrypted. What's in it? Patient names, as Delaney told you. Also facility access codes, medication system credentials, and a secondary contact listed only as RH. He let the initials land. The medication system credentials are registered to an account that was created 6 weeks ago using Holt's administrative profile as an authorization reference. Holt, who is currently in Bay 4 with a scalp laceration and a possible concussion under medical monitoring, with one of the federal agents posted near the bay. 6 weeks ago, she said, which predates this morning by enough time to suggest this wasn't reactive. This was planned. He looked at the floor, then back at her. Holt is claiming he has no knowledge of the account or the directory. He's been cooperative since we told him about the rerouting signal. Cooperative as in providing information, or cooperative as in performing cooperation? Voss looked at her for a moment. That distinction is exactly why Carver is in that room with him right now. He paused. There's something else. There usually is. The man Tremaine described, the false liaison, Philip Tate. We've identified him from the description and from a partial match in the National Guard installation's visitor log. He set a photograph on the workstation, a printed still from a security camera, grainy but identifiable. His name is Brendan Kelso. He's a former Meridian logistics consultant who was flagged in the original federal investigation into Meridian 4 years ago and then dropped off the radar. He's currently listed as a healthcare operations consultant with a firm based in Denver. She looked at the photograph. Medium build, gray at the temples. The jaw scar wasn't visible in the image, but the bone structure matched Tremaine's description. And Farwell knows him, she said. They overlapped at Meridian for 18 months before Farwell went to medical school. They were in the same division. He picked the photograph back up. Kelso is not in custody. We have a bolo, but he's had a significant head start. She thought about the stairwell, the footsteps that had stopped. He might not have left, she said. Voss went still. You think he's still in the building? I think the medication errors post-Farwell's arrest mean someone with system access was still operational at 8:03, and I heard someone in the east stairwell at approximately 8:07. She looked at the corridor. The loading dock on the south side. My agent said she was covering it, but I'll check. He had his radio out, but before he keyed it, he looked at her with the direct attention of someone who had been reassessing a situation across the course of a morning and had reached a conclusion. You've been running 3 parallel tracks since 5:12 a.m. Patient care, threat assessment, and evidence coordination. I want you to know that's not something most people can do. It's not something I've seen very often. She looked at him. I've had practice. I know. He keyed the radio. She listened to him direct 2 agents to the south loading dock and 2 more to a sweep of the east corridor and basement access. And while he was doing it, she turned back to the station and pulled up the system access log that Greer had sent through, because there was still a thread she hadn't pulled. The IP address on the 803 modification was internal, a hospital network address, but it was routing through a subnet that corresponded to the administrative offices on the 2nd floor. Not the nursing stations, not the ER workstations. The 2nd floor, where Holt's office was located, and the administrative conference rooms, and she pulled up the hospital's internal network directory and found it in 40 seconds. The guest wireless access point that served visitors to the administrative suite and had its own login that was, based on the directory entry, a fixed credential that had not been changed in 14 months. A fixed credential. On a guest network. In an administrative building. She wrote the credential down on a piece of paper and took it to Delaney. At 8:44, they found Brendan Kelso in the administrative suite on the 2nd floor. He was in the secondary conference room with a laptop connected to the hospital's guest network, and he had the look of someone who had been in the middle of a task and had heard the agents coming from far enough away to close the laptop, but not far enough away to leave the room. He was standing near the window when they entered. 3 agents, Delaney at the front, with his hands visible and his face arranged in the expression of a man attempting, in real time, to construct a story that fit the facts on the ground. He didn't get far into it before Delaney told him he was under arrest, and the agents moved in. Mara wasn't there for it. She was on the ER floor because the ER floor was where she needed to be, and she found out the details from Delaney 20 minutes later in a 2-sentence briefing while she was checking on Torres in Bay 3. They had him. The laptop had been forensically seized. The connection to the medication system was confirmed from the device logs. What was the plan? She asked. What was the full operation? Delaney sat on the edge of the workstation, the first time Mara had seen her sit anywhere, with the loose-jointed quality of someone operating on the far edge of their reserves. As best we can reconstruct it, Meridian had a secondary contract with SOCOM that they lost 4 years ago when the investigation started. A contract worth, over its lifetime, somewhere north of $400 million. The contract went to a competing firm. Kelso and at least 3 other former Meridian executives have spent the last 4 years building a network to discredit that competing firm and the military medical contracts it holds. She rubbed the back of her neck. One way to discredit a medical contractor is to create a catastrophic outcome that they're associated with. An event that gets tied to their logistics network. 87 wounded soldiers dying in a hospital that wasn't equipped to receive them, routed there by what appears to be a failure in the competitor's routing software. That's a contract-killing event. Federal investigations, congressional hearings, the whole mechanism. Mara thought about that. They needed the outcome to be catastrophic. They needed at least significant mortality. 17 to 22 fatalities would have been enough to trigger a congressional inquiry. Delaney looked at her. The projection assumed this hospital's response would be standard, which, based on everything up to this morning, it would have been. And Farwell was Kelso's inside person. Farwell stood to receive a consulting contract with Meridian's successor, entity worth approximately $2 million over 5 years if the operation succeeded. Holt. She paused. Holt is more complicated. He may have been used rather than complicit. The account was created using his credentials without his active participation. We're still working through it. Mara processed this. A network of former defense contractors, a financial motive, a plan built on the assumption that a hospital's inadequate response would be its own weapon. Patients as casualties in a commercial dispute. The quiet particular fury that she had been holding since she found the unlabeled bag in Bay 7 moved through her and settled somewhere harder. Farwell, she said. What's he saying? He's currently in federal custody at the National Guard installation. His attorney arrived 40 minutes ago. Delaney's voice was even. He said very little since the attorney got there. But before the attorney arrived, he said something to the agent taking his statement. She paused. He said he never thought it would work. He said he thought the hospital would manage because hospitals always managed. He thought it was a financial scheme with a low probability of actual harm. Mara looked at the floor, at the bays, at the 87 people who were alive this morning by margins that Farwell had apparently decided were someone else's problem. He thought the hospital would manage, she said. That's what he said. After he pulled the most experienced trauma coordinator from the rotation at 4:09 in the morning, 22 minutes after the convoy was rerouted. Delaney met her eyes. I know. He cleared the floor for the outcome to happen, and then told himself the outcome wouldn't happen. She shook her head, not with disbelief. She had seen this variety of self-justifying logic in operational settings before, the human capacity to engineer a catastrophe while maintaining a sufficient level of deniability in their own mind, but with a recognition of how ordinary and how devastating it was. What happens to him? Federal charges, conspiracy, negligent endangerment of federal personnel, obstruction of emergency medical care for active military. Kelso faces the same plus several others. Delaney straightened up from the workstation. This is going to go through the federal system, not the hospital's internal process. Farwell's medical license is a state board issue, but the federal case takes precedence. And Holt? Still being interviewed. If he was used rather than complicit, he may face administrative and civil liability, but not criminal. If there's evidence he knew, she let the sentence finish itself. The OR called at 9:12 with news that broke something loose in Mara's chest. Marcus Webb was out of surgery. Both surgeries, the primary procedure and the emergency vascular repair that Totten and Dolores had performed together with the particular improvised coordination of two people who had never worked in the same room before finding themselves inside the same crisis. The splenic artery bleed was controlled. The post-operative prognosis was cautious but substantively improved. Webb was in recovery, and his vitals were, in Totten's careful phrasing, better than I had any right to expect given the circumstances. Mara wrote the update in the patient log and stood with her hand on the station for a moment. 87 incoming, none lost. The number had felt theoretical at 4:47 in the morning when she was running from the staff lounge to the floor. Now it felt like something else, something with weight. She didn't let herself stay in that moment longer than about 10 seconds, because there were still patients who needed monitoring and two who were not yet out of the high-risk window, and the floor ran on function, not sentiment. But she let herself have the 10 seconds. Then she moved. Holt came out of Bay 4 at 9:30 with a bandage above his left ear and the bearing of a man who was doing the visible work of keeping himself upright. He was accompanied by Carver and one of the other agents, and the small procession moved with the specific quality of people who had reached a point in a conversation from which there was no return. He stopped when he saw Mara. She was at the central station doing a patient status update, and she looked up because the change in the room's attention was the kind of thing she had always registered without trying to. The nurses near the station found reasons to look somewhere else. The agent near the corridor entrance straightened slightly. Priya, coming from Bay 6 with a chart, slowed her pace. Holt looked at her for a moment. His face was doing something complicated. Not the professional composure he usually wore, not the controlled authority. Something below that. Something that had the texture of a man confronting the gap between who he believed he was and what the morning had revealed. It wasn't a transformation. People didn't transform in an hour and a half of federal questioning. But there was something in his expression that she hadn't seen there at 4:09 when he'd reassigned her. Something that might eventually become an honest accounting. "Ms. Dowell," he said. She waited. He seemed to organize what he wanted to say, and then discard it, and then try again. "I was told, the federal team told me, the specific outcome projections, what the rerouting was designed to produce." He stopped. "And I was told about the medication system, what was done." He looked at the floor of his hospital. "Farwell had access I gave him, access I signed off on. I didn't know what he was using it for, but I should have known there was something wrong, and I didn't look." He brought his eyes back up. "That's on me." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It is." He nodded, something in his face absorbing that without argument. He turned to go with Carver, then stopped. "The reassignment," he said. "This morning. That's also on me." "I know," she said. He walked out. She watched him go, and then she turned back to the station because the station needed her more than that moment did. By 10:15, the floor had reached a different kind of equilibrium. Not calm. It was still a mass casualty environment and would be for hours, possibly days. But the acute danger had resolved into the sustained work of monitoring and recovery, the phase that required different skills than the crisis phase. Patience, attention to gradual change, the capacity to maintain vigilance without the adrenaline that made it easy. Reeves appeared at the station at 10:22, with his arm in a proper sling and the careful movement of someone who had been told 3 times to stop using the arm and had listened to approximately half of that instruction. "I heard they got the guy, the second one." "They did," she said. "Second floor, guest network." He shook his head. "Audacity. I'll give him that. Don't admire it too much." "No, ma'am." He was quiet for a moment. "I also heard what you did. The medication check. Priya, your nurse, she said you ordered it before any of the investigators had even thought of it. Priya did the check because you told her to." Mara didn't answer that directly. "How's your arm?" "It's an arm with a hole in it. It hurts." He said it matter-of-factly, with the particular attitude of someone for whom pain was a condition to be managed rather than a narrative. "Can I ask you something?" She looked at him. "When you left the service," he paused, choosing the words. "Was it because of Coravan?" The name of the valley again. She had been carrying it since he first said it, carrying it the way she always carried it. Not with grief exactly, because grief was not the cleanest word for what that night had left in her, but with the weight of 14 people who were alive because of decisions she had made in the dark, in a foreign valley, with inadequate equipment and no backup. "Coravan was one part of it," she said. "Did you leave because of what happened, or because of what happened after?" She looked at him directly. "After." He nodded slowly. "The review." "The review," she confirmed. After Coravan, there had been a formal incident review of the Cassavac operation. The review had concluded, correctly, that Mara's decisions had saved the lives of 14 personnel in conditions that exceeded the parameters of her role. It had also concluded, with the particular institutional logic of systems that are uncomfortable with individuals who operate outside their defined lane, that several of her decisions had exceeded her authority as a medic and constituted unauthorized medical practice. The practical consequence of the review had been a letter of reprimand and a reassignment. She had submitted her separation request 4 months later. "That review was wrong," Reeves said. "The review was an institutional document doing institutional work," she said. "It wasn't entirely wrong. I did operate outside my role. You kept 14 people alive, and I'm glad I did. Both things can be true." She looked at him. "The institution needed to protect itself. I needed to decide whether I could keep operating inside an institution that needed that protection more than it needed to acknowledge what actually happened." She paused. "I decided I couldn't. That was my choice. I don't regret it." I was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, the people who were there, They never forgot what that review said, or who it was about. She looked at the floor, then back at him. "Get back to your bay, Reeves." "Yes, ma'am," he said, for the third time, and went. Osem. Voss found her at 11 Husharts in the staff lounge, which was where she had gone for 8 minutes to drink coffee. She still didn't particularly want and to be somewhere that wasn't the floor, not because she needed to stop, but because she had learned, over years of high-pressure operations, that voluntary pauses prevented involuntary ones. He sat down across from her without asking. She didn't mind. "Kelso is talking," he said. "About what?" "About everything. His attorney is negotiating cooperation terms, but in the preliminary, he's confirmed the full structure. 3 other former Meridian executives, a funding network through 2 shell entities in Delaware, and a timeline that goes back 22 months. He folded his hands on the table. He also confirmed something about your reassignment." She looked at him. "Farwell's complaint against you, the one Holt acted on this morning, was not spontaneous. Farwell was asked to create a documented cause for your removal that could be executed quickly and would hold up to a basic review. Kelso confirmed that your name specifically was part of their planning." He paused. "They knew you were on the rotation. They ran a background check on hospital staff 6 weeks ago when they were planning the timeline. Your service record came up." She was still. "They removed you specifically," Voss said, "because they identified you specifically as the variable most likely to disrupt the projected outcome." The lounge was quiet, except for the fluorescent light buzzing at its familiar frequency. "They knew who I was," she said. "They knew enough. They didn't have the classified record. That's still sealed. But Meridian had access to enough DoD personnel data from their former contracting period to flag a special operations combat medic with your background as a risk factor." He looked at her steadily. "They built their plan around your absence, which means the plan failed, structurally, the moment you walked back onto that floor." She sat with that. The plan had failed because she had walked back onto the floor, because she had looked at an ER that wasn't mobilizing and picked up the trauma shears, because Farwell's effort to remove her had been timed to a rerouting that assumed she would stay removed, and she hadn't, and 87 people were alive because the operational planning of a commercial conspiracy had not adequately accounted for the fact that she did not know how to stand on the other side of a door from a crisis and do nothing. She drank the coffee. "There's something else," Voss said. She waited. He reached into the folder he'd been carrying and placed a single page on the table between them. She looked at it. It was a document from the Office of Special Operations Medical Command, and her eyes moved down it quickly enough to catch the structure before the specifics. Formal notation, her full name in the header, a reference number that corresponded to the incident review from 4 years ago. "What is this?" she said. "The review board is being reconvened," Voss said. "What happened this morning is formally on record now, including your service background, your operational history, and your role in the Coravon case vac. The combination of those things has created grounds to revisit the reprimand in your file." He paused. "I can't promise you what the board will conclude, but I can tell you that the people who will be sitting on it are people who read the same file I read and who saw the same outcome this morning that I saw, and that I will be submitting a personal statement." She looked at the page for a long moment. "You didn't ask if I wanted this," she said. "Would you have said yes?" She looked at him. "I don't know." "That's honest." He left the page on the table. "You don't have to decide anything now. The process will move at its own pace." He stood. "But you should know it's in motion." He walked out of the lounge. She sat with the page in front of her and the coffee going cold in her hand, and outside the door she could hear the ER moving through its morning, monitors, voices, the particular sound of a floor that was functioning. And she thought about what Voss had said. The plan had failed because she had walked back onto the floor. She thought about that for a little while longer. Then she stood up, left the coffee on the table, and went back to work. It was 11:47 when Priya came to the station with a look that Mara had learned over 3 years meant something was wrong in a specific way. Not a patient emergency, not a clinical crisis, but the kind of interpersonal or institutional wrong that landed differently. "There's someone at the entrance," Priya said. "He's asking for you by name. He has credentials, federal," he said. "But he's not one of the people who came in with Voss's team." Mara looked up. "Did he badge in with security?" "He showed credentials to the desk. She logged him in. He said he's here about the formal review of the incident. He said, Priya paused. He said he's here about your record specifically. She set down the chart. What's his name? He said his name is Garrison. Priya frowned slightly. But it's not Holt. Different first name. He said he's from the DOD Inspector General's office. Mara was still. The DOD Inspector General's office. Not SOCOM Medical Command. Not the federal investigative team that had been operating under Voss's authority all morning. A separate arm. A different office entirely, one whose jurisdiction covered not the conspiracy investigation, but the personnel records, the service histories, the incident reviews, the formal documentation of what people had done and hadn't done in classified settings. Someone from the Inspector General's office who had arrived, not with Voss, but separately. Not in the middle of the emergency, but now. As the emergency resolved, as the review was set in motion, as the pieces were falling into a shape that was beginning to look like vindication, she thought about what Voss had said. The plan had failed because she walked back onto the floor. She thought about the fact that plans sometimes had contingencies. Where is he? She said. Waiting room off the main entrance, Priya said. He said he'd wait as long as necessary. Mara pulled her badge straight on her scrubs and walked toward the main entrance, and the thing moving through her was not fear, and it was not uncertainty, but it was something, a cold and careful alertness, the same quality she had felt in the stairwell doorway, in the ambulance bay before the explosion, in every moment this morning where she had been a fraction of a second ahead of something coming. She pushed through the entrance to the waiting room. The man standing near the window was in his mid-50s, neat in a way that was bureaucratic rather than military, with a face she didn't recognize. But his hand, when he turned toward her, was moving toward the inside pocket of his jacket, and the speed of that movement was not the speed of someone reaching for a credential. She moved before the hand cleared the jacket. Not toward him, toward the side, the wall, the angle that took her out of the direct line between where he was standing and the door, the same instinct that had put her beside the stairwell rather than in front of it, the same geometry that had kept her on the right side of the ambulance bay entrance when everything went wrong. She was already calling out before she fully processed what she was seeing, because in the half-second it took to register the movement, the training was already ahead of her conscious mind. Federal agent, waiting room, her voice carried the way it was built to carry. Not panicked. A report. The man's hand stopped. What came out of his jacket pocket was a phone. I was holding it up, the screen facing her, with the expression of someone who had just watched a situation escalate past anything they had prepared for and was now very carefully not moving. His face had gone the color of old plaster. On the phone screen was what appeared to be a document, federal letterhead, small text she couldn't read from the distance. And his other hand was raised, palm out, in the universal human signal for, I am not a threat, please stop doing whatever you are about to do. 2 agents came through the door behind her in under 4 seconds. The man with the phone said, in a voice that was impressively steady given the circumstances, My name is Walter Pruitt. I am a records officer with the DOD Inspector General's office, and I have a formal notification for a Ms. Mara Dowell, and I would very much like to give it to her and then leave. The agents looked at Mara. She looked at Pruitt. She breathed once, deliberate and controlled, the kind of breath that moved the adrenaline through its cycle without letting it make decisions for her. Then she crossed the room, took the phone from his hand, and looked at the document on the screen. It was a formal notification, exactly as he'd said, from the DOD Inspector General's Records Division. Brief, bureaucratic, stripped of anything that could be called emotional register. It informed her that the incident review from 4 years prior, case reference number attached, had been placed under administrative hold pending formal reconvening, and that all associated personnel notations, including the letter of reprimand in her service record, were suspended from active status during the review period. She read it twice. You could have emailed this, she said. Pruitt lowered his still raised hand. The notification requires in-person delivery and documented receipt. It's a procedural requirement. He looked at the 2 agents flanking him. I was not briefed on the broader situation here. I was sent to deliver a document. She handed the phone back. Receipt acknowledged, she said. You can go. He went, with the purposeful speed of a man who had somewhere else to be and had found an excellent motivation to get there. The 2 agents looked at her. Stand down, she said, and walked back to the floor. Check. The letter of reprimand was suspended. She turned that fact over in her mind while she moved through the morning, checking patients and adjusting lines and reviewing the post-surgical updates, letting the fact settle into the broader context of everything the morning had produced without giving it more ceremony than it deserved. It wasn't exoneration yet. The review board hadn't convened, hadn't concluded, hadn't issued anything final. The suspension was procedural. It meant the record was in question, not that the question had been answered. But 4 years of carrying a letter of reprimand in a service file, 4 years of leaving a version of herself in a foreign valley with inadequate equipment and a judgment that said the manner in which she had kept 14 people alive was technically improper. 4 years of that, and now the first formal crack in the wall of it. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for crying in the middle of a shift, and she wasn't going to start now. But she stood at the station for a moment longer than the task required, her hand flat on the surface, and let the weight of it move through her. Then she checked the monitor on Webb's post-op status, noted the improved numbers, and updated the log. By noon, Harlow General had been formally designated a federal incident site for the duration of the investigation, which meant a parallel administrative structure running alongside the medical one, which meant paperwork and coordination that fell to everyone simultaneously. Mara managed her portion of it with the same approach she brought to everything. Address what's immediate, document what's consequential, delegate what can be delegated, and don't let the bureaucratic layer slow the clinical one. The full picture of what Kelso and Farwell had built emerged across the afternoon in the pieces that Delaney and Carver shared with her as they became available, each piece adding resolution to a photograph she had been looking at in part since 5 a.m. Meridian's former logistics division had been quietly reconstructing itself under a series of shell entities for 2 years. The operation at Harlow General was not their first attempt to engineer a catastrophic outcome connected to their competitors' contracts. There had been a prior event at a civilian facility in Nevada 8 months earlier that had not succeeded, attributed at the time to a routine medical error, now flagged for re-examination in light of the Harlow investigation. Kelso had designed the Harlow operation as an improvement on Nevada. More targets, a higher profile event, a tighter window of execution. The false liaison, the rerouting intercept, the inside access through Farwell, the medication system manipulation. Each element was designed to be deniable on its own and devastating in combination. What Kelso had not designed for was a former Special Operations combat medic working a trauma rotation in a rural Montana hospital at 4:47 in the morning. He had identified her, flagged her, and removed her from the equation before the convoy arrived. He had simply not anticipated that the equation would refuse to cooperate with her removal. Carver put it plainly when he came to give her the afternoon briefing. His threat assessment identified you as a high-risk variable. His risk mitigation plan was to eliminate your role an hour before the event. What he got wrong was the assumption that a person can be fully removed from a situation by removing their job title. She looked at him. "Is that going into the federal report?" In more formal language, he said, "Yes." Stuart Farwell was formally charged at 2:00 p.m. in a federal proceeding at the National Guard installation. The charges read, in the dry language of federal criminal complaint, like an accounting, conspiracy to endanger federal military personnel, deliberate obstruction of emergency medical care, unauthorized access to protected federal communications systems, material participation in a scheme to defraud a federal contractor. Each charge was separate, specific, and accompanied by evidence that had been gathered in the 7 hours since the convoy arrived. Mara heard about the charges from Priya, who had gotten it from one of the junior agents in a hallway conversation, which was how information moved in an environment where official channels and informal ones ran in parallel. She was between patients when Priya told her, and her response was to note the time in the patient log for no particular reason except that her hands needed something to do. She thought about what Delaney had said, that Farwell had told himself the hospital would manage. She thought about the 45 seconds it had taken her to look at an unmobilized ER and understand what needed to happen, and about what the floor would have looked like without those 45 seconds, and about whether Farwell had really believed the hospital would manage, or whether believing it had simply been more comfortable than not believing it. She suspected it was the latter. In her experience, the people who engineered harm and then told themselves the harm wouldn't happen were not usually people who had done a careful probability assessment. They were people who had found a story that let them keep moving forward and then had moved forward and had arranged their understanding of the consequences to fit the story rather than the other way around. It was a very human failure. It was still a failure that had nearly killed 87 people. She set the pen down and went to check on Tremaine. Brennan Kelso was transferred to federal custody at 3:15 p.m., driven out of the hospital's administrative parking area in one of the federal SUVs with the kind of efficiency that spoke to preparation. Several of the staff saw it from windows. Nobody cheered because these were medical professionals, and not that kind of crowd, but the quality of the silence when it happened had a specific texture. The particular quiet of people who had been in a building where something terrible had been attempted and had watched the attempt fail, and who were now watching the person responsible leave in handcuffs. Mara watched from the second-floor window of the administrative suite, where she had gone to retrieve a patient record from the cabinet that the federal team had cleared for access again. She watched the SUV pull out. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt tired and clear, and something that she would eventually identify as completion. Not an ending, because endings were rarely clean, but the sense of a circle drawn, of something that had needed to happen having happened. She went back downstairs. Garrison Holt resigned as hospital director at 4:30 in the afternoon. The resignation was communicated through his attorney, delivered to the hospital's board of trustees in a letter that Mara never read and wasn't given access to. What she knew was that at 4:47, precisely 12 hours after she had first heard the emergency dispatch transmission in the staff lounge, the hospital's deputy director, a woman named Susan Okafor, who had been running operational logistics since noon and who had the bearing of someone who had been quietly competent for years, while someone less competent occupied the more visible role, came to the central station and told Mara that the board had accepted the resignation and that she, Okafor, was serving as acting director pending formal appointment. "I wanted to tell you directly," Okafor said, "before you heard it sideways." Mara looked at her. She had spoken to Okafor perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. The brief professional interactions of two people operating in different institutional lanes. What she saw in Okafor's face now was something she recognized. The particular combination of capability and restraint of a person who had been doing the work while someone else held the title. "Thank you," Mara said. "The board is also going to want to speak with you," Okafor said. "Not about discipline, about the protocols. What you did this morning, the triage structure, the medication check, the facility reorganization, they want to formalize it, build it into standing procedure. The triage structure is standard mass casualty protocol. I didn't invent it. You implemented it in 9 minutes under active obstruction." Okafor paused. "That's not nothing." Mara didn't answer that directly. "The medication verification procedure needs to be permanent. Manual cross-check against paper records, every shift, not just mass casualty events. The automated system is only as good as its data, and if the data can be manipulated, I'll take that to the board," Okafor said, along with the recommendation to change the guest network credentials quarterly at minimum. She looked at the floor around them, at the bays, the staff, the controlled activity of a unit that had run hard for 12 hours and was still running. "You built something this morning that held. I wanted you to know that's been observed." She walked away, and Mara turned back to the station. The formal session with Colonel Voss and the federal team happened at 5:30 in the small conference room on the ground floor, and it was not the kind of debrief she had experienced in operational settings, efficient, structured, focused on actionable intelligence, but something slightly more complicated, occupying the space between official record-making and something closer to reckoning. Carver presented the consolidated findings. The conspiracy's full scope. Kelso, Farwell, 2 additional former Meridian executives who had been identified through the laptop's communication logs and who were in the process of being located and taken into custody, and the financial network behind them. The specific mechanism of the operation, the timeline, the evidence chain. When he finished, Voss looked at Mara across the table. "The record you've built today," he said, "is going in front of the review board in its entirety, including testimony from my office." He paused. "I want to be direct with you about something. The original review wasn't entirely wrong in its procedural findings. You did operate outside your designated role at Coravan. That's a factual matter." He held her eyes. What the review failed to adequately weigh was context, outcome, and the reasonable judgment available to a medic in field conditions with no access to a physician and 14 lives in immediate danger. That's what the reconvened board will address. What outcome are you expecting? She asked. I'm expecting the reprimand to be vacated and the record amended. He said it plainly. I'm not promising that, but it's what I'm expecting. She thought about how to respond to that and decided the honest response was the only useful one. I left the service because I couldn't keep operating in an environment where that judgment had been formally questioned. Not because I disagreed with every aspect of the review, because I disagreed with what it said about whether the outcome mattered. She paused. The outcome was 14 people alive. I needed to work somewhere that thought that mattered more than the lane I was supposed to stay in. It mattered, Voss said. It mattered then. It matters in the record. He set his hands flat on the table. It also mattered this morning, and this morning wasn't in a classified valley with no witnesses. This morning happened in a federally designated facility with documentation, surveillance, and 87 surviving witnesses. He paused. Some of whom have already submitted written statements. She looked at him. Unsolicited, he said. Reeves started it. Tremaine submitted his separately. By this afternoon, we had 14 statements from convoy personnel specifically addressing your role in their care and survival. He let that number land. 14. The same number as Coravan. She didn't say that. But it moved through her like something with weight and shape, the kind of coincidence that wasn't meaningful in any objective sense, and was nonetheless the kind of thing a person carried. I'll engage with the review process, she said. Whatever it needs from me. Voss nodded. That's all I needed to know. The last patient from the original convoy was moved out of the immediate monitoring category at 7:22 p.m. Marcus Webb, who had been the highest-risk post-operative case all day, cleared the threshold that his surgeon had established as the marker for stable trajectory, and the OR team that had been working since before dawn had the particular exhausted satisfaction of people who had pushed through to the other side of something very hard and found everyone still breathing. Mara heard about it at the station and updated the log. 87. All of them. She sat with that number for a moment the same way she had sat with it at noon, letting it be what it was rather than making it into something larger. The number was not a reflection on her. It was a reflection on the nurses who had moved when she told them to move, on Priya who had done the medication check without hesitation, on the residents who had run bays they'd never run before and had called for backup when they needed it and kept moving, on Dolores, who had walked into an OR with a vascular surgeon he'd never met and helped close a bleed with field techniques and steady hands, on Totten, who had made the call to accept that help rather than waiting for an ideal that wasn't available, on Reeves and Tremaine and Torres and Webb and every person who had trusted the floor that had been built for them in 9 minutes before they arrived. It was not a perfect outcome. It was not clean or effortless or free of near misses. It was the outcome produced by a collection of imperfect people making the best decisions available to them under pressure, and that was, in Mara's experience, the only kind of good outcome that existed. She wrote the number in the log. Then she closed the log and looked up. Priya was at the end of the station, finishing a chart. She looked up when she felt Mara's attention and raised an eyebrow. All 87, Mara said. Priya set the chart down. Her expression moved through something that was too complicated to name in a single word. Then she picked the chart back up and said, I'm going to need 2 more nurses on the overnight. The staff who've been here since before 5 a.m. need to go home. Agreed, Mara said. Call the roster. Well, Voss came to find her at 8 p.m. when the federal operation was winding down to its post-acute phase. Documentation, custody transfers, evidence processing, the long administrative tale of a morning that had changed the shape of everything. He found her in the corridor outside Bay 7, where Tremaine had been asking for an extra blanket, and she had been the closest person when the request came in, which was how things went in hospitals on long shifts. There's something I want to tell you before I leave, Voss said, and then I'm going to leave and let you finish your work. She waited. When I read your file this morning, before I arrived, during the transit, I noted the Coravan record and the review, and I formed an opinion about the institutional decision. He paused. My opinion was that the institution had made a choice that protected the institution, which institutions frequently do, and that the cost of that choice had been paid by the person least responsible for the conditions that made it necessary. He looked at the corridor. I formed that opinion before. It doesn't usually produce a morning like this one. Usually what it produces is a person who left and didn't come back, and a gap in the system where that person should have been. She looked at him. You came back, he said. Not to the service, but you came back to the work. He paused. Some people can't do that. The institutional damage is too much, or the personal cost is too high, or the anger at the injustice of it makes the work impossible. You apparently came back to a rural trauma rotation in Montana because the work itself was more important than the context. He let that settle. I don't know if that's admirable or stubborn. Both, she said. Something moved across his face. Yes, both. He extended his hand. Thank you for this morning. She shook it. Thank you for the document on the table. He almost smiled. That was Delaney's idea. She said you'd be more likely to engage with the process if you had a physical piece of paper to react to. She was right. He walked down the corridor and she watched him go. And then she went back to the bay because Tremaine's blanket had arrived and needed to be sorted, and because the floor didn't stop needing her because the day had become significant. The review board convened 6 weeks later in a federal building in Denver, and Mara drove the 4 hours herself rather than flying, which gave her time to think and also gave her something to do with her hands. The board was 3 people. She had met none of them. They had read the files, the original Corovan report, the incident review, the 4 years of subsequent service record, the full Harlow General Incident documentation, the 14 unsolicited personnel statements, and Voss's formal submission, which she had been given a copy of and which was the most thorough and precise and fair document she had ever seen written about her without her participation. The proceeding lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. It was procedurally formal and humanly difficult because revisiting the valley meant revisiting the night, and revisiting the night meant sitting inside the specific quality of darkness and cold and impossible arithmetic that she had spent 4 years learning to carry rather than put down. She answered every question directly. She said, when asked, that she had operated outside her designated role because the alternative was watching 14 people die with the tools available to keep them alive. She said she understood why the review had found it procedurally problematic. She said she did not regret the decision and could not honestly say she would make a different one. The lead board member, a retired surgeon with an expression she couldn't read, looked at her for a moment after that answer and said, "We're not asking you to regret it." The board deliberated for 50 minutes. The letter they issued was formal and measured and final. The reprimand was vacated. The service record was amended to reflect the correct accounting of the Corovan case evac, a notation of extraordinary medical performance under extreme field conditions, resulting in the preservation of 14 personnel, under a citation that had the particular dry understatement of official military language attempting to describe something it didn't quite have the vocabulary for. She drove back to Creston Valley in the same car, on the same road, with the same 4 hours to think. What she thought about was not triumph. It was too large and too old to feel like triumph. What she felt was something closer to what happens when a weight has been in one place for so long that you forget what it was like not to carry it, and then one day it isn't there, and you keep reaching for it before you remember. She thought about the 14 people in the valley. She thought about the 87 people on the floor. She thought about Priya checking medication lines with the same focus and precision that Mara had spent 3 years quietly building in her, and about Totten in the OR, making the call to accept Dolores's help rather than waiting for perfect conditions, and about every person who had run a bay they'd never run before, and had called for backup when they needed it rather than pretending they didn't. She thought about what Voss had said, that some people couldn't come back, that the institutional damage was too much, or the anger made the work impossible. She had been angry. She was still, underneath everything, angry, not the burning kind, but the structural kind, the kind that had long since been incorporated into how she moved through the world and what she refused to accept. She was angry that it had taken 4 years and a federal incident and 14 written statements to get a review board to look at a night that should have been looked at clearly from the beginning. She was angry that the institution had needed to protect itself more than it had needed to protect its accounting of what actually happened. She was angry that Farwell and Kelso had been able to build a conspiracy on the assumption that a hospital's inadequacy was a reliable weapon, because that assumption had been earned through years of systems that valued the appearance of function over its substance. But the anger had never been more powerful than the work. That was the thing she had figured out somewhere in the 3 years between Coravan and this morning, in the quiet of a rural trauma rotation and the accumulated weight of shifts that needed her more than she needed to resolve anything about herself. The anger was real, and the anger was right, but it wasn't the engine. The work was the engine. She pulled into Creston Valley at sunset, the mountains going orange and brown on the western horizon, and drove to the hospital because her shift started at 6:00 p.m., and she had left it in Priya's hands for long enough. The ER at 6:00 p.m. on a Tuesday was not the ER it had been at 4:47 on that Thursday morning. The federal presence was reduced to a documentation team and a liaison officer. The last 3 convoy patients had been transferred to their home facilities or to the National Guard installation for continued care. The bays that had held 20 immediate cases simultaneously were back to their regular occupancy: a construction injury in Bay 2, a respiratory case in Bay 4, a 17-year-old with a broken wrist in Bay 6, who was managing her pain with the impressive stoicism of a teenager determined not to let her parents know how much it actually hurt. Mara walked through the entrance. Priya looked up from the station. Her expression did the thing it did when she was calibrating a response and not quite landing on one. "How'd it go?" she said. "It went." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I have right now." Priya looked at her for another second, reading whatever was in her face with the accuracy of someone who had worked closely with another person long enough to have developed a secondary vocabulary of expression and posture. Then she nodded, in the specific way of someone who understood that some things didn't have words yet. "Bay 6 needs a secondary splint check," she said, "and the construction case in 2 is going to need imaging before we can rule out a spinal component." "I'll take Bay 2 first," Mara said. "Get imaging prepped." She clipped her badge to her scrubs. She pulled her hair back tighter, the specific way she did it at the start of a shift, the small physical act of transition from whatever she was outside the floor to what she was on it. She walked toward Bay 2. Behind her, she could hear the ER doing what ERs did: monitors and voices and the specific texture of a place where people arrived in pieces and needed someone to hold the parts together long enough for the body's own machinery to take over. It was not glamorous work. It was frequently thankless and routinely frustrating and occasionally, without warning, devastating in the specific way that work with human lives was always at risk of being devastating. She had chosen it anyway. She kept choosing it. Not because it was easy, and not because the institution had earned her loyalty, and not because the system had treated her with anything approaching the fairness it had taken 6 years and a federal incident to begin to produce. She had chosen it because on the other side of every bad night, there were people who were alive that might not have been, and because she was one of the people in the world who knew how to make that happen, and because knowing how to do something that mattered and then not doing it was the kind of waste she couldn't make peace with. The system had been wrong about her. She had found ways to work inside it anyway. The institution had tried to make her smaller than she was. She had simply continued being the size she was, in the corridors available to her, until the space expanded to fit. That wasn't a lesson she had been taught. It was one she had figured out the hard way. In a valley, and a staff room, and an unmobilized ER at 4:47 in the morning, and it had cost her years and a service record and more than she would ever be able to name accurately. But she was here. Still here. The floor ran because she was on it, and the people in the bays had a better chance because she was the one walking through the door. That wasn't nothing. She pulled back the curtain on Bay 2 and said to the construction worker with the possible spinal component, in the calm, direct voice she had been using since before he arrived, "I'm Mara. Tell me where it hurts." And she listened, the way she had always listened, like it was the only thing in the room that mattered, because right now, it was.